Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian. During the Great War, the Imperial German Navy was one of the largest military organizations on Earth. But after decades of operating with a nearly unlimited budget, the Kaiser's Grand Fleet was ignominiously scuttled after the German surrender. In this video, we'll see how the Kaiser's successors began working in secret to restore their nation's position as a major naval, and how various strategies and goals were examined during the interwar period, and how admirals like Erich Raeder worked to establish a coherent plan for German naval supremacy on the high seas, only to see it collapse in the face of mismanagement, resource shortages, and the eternal bickering between the three main branches of the military. Special thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Warpath. Time to relocate Sniper. Go. Where are they? Immerse yourself in the campaign and watch your men progress from raw recruits to hardened families. Equip your army with a vast arsenal of authentic weapons and help them evolve into an elite fighting force. Use real tactics and strategies to outmaneuver, surround, and flank your enemies. Set foot on the warpath, make strategic alliances, and rewrite history by downloading the game today. Following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Republic was allowed only a handful of obsolete surface vessels. Submarines were banned, as was a naval aviation program. Furthermore, public perception of the Navy was overwhelmingly negative, with many critics going so far as to shrilly blame the Imperial German Navy for having lost the war. With virtually no funding or public support, the disgraced veterans of the High Seas Fleet were forced to go back to the drawing board, digging deep into their archives to try and figure out exactly where they had gone wrong. And more importantly, what they could do better next time. From the late 1910s to the mid-1920s, the new Kriegsmarine dispatched students across the globe to attend various foreign naval academies, while high-ranking officers conducted yearly war games and wrote in-depth treatises on all manner of subjects. One particularly prolific publicist was Vice Admiral Wolfgang Wigner, whose collected works, entitled Naval Strategy in the World, highlighted the strategic importance of Denmark and Norway, whose harbors and airfields could be used as forward bases to strike at the Atlantic trade routes. He also pointed out that Germany had utterly failed to cut Britain off from maritime trade, leaving it with no leverage over its enemies. As a result, the Imperial Navy's only major fleet engagement had occurred at the inconclusive Battle of Jutland, which ultimately did nothing to change the status quo. Wigner's arguments were strongly based on the works of American naval officer Alfred Tyerman, and postulated that future success would require the German Navy to seize French ports on the English Channel, disrupt the Atlantic trade routes, and create a situation where the Royal Navy was forced into a decisive engagement on German terms, where it could be destroyed once and for all. Standing in stark opposition to the Mann-Weiner school of thinking was Admiral Erich Raeder, who had no expectation of Germany being able to face the Royal Navy on even terms again, until at least the late 1940s. Raeder instead endorsed the idea of a small but flexible force of coastal defense vessels, sufficient to protect German assets, backed up by a fleet of commerce raiders, cruisers, and small aircraft carriers that could operate anywhere on the high seas. His assertion was that such a fleet composition would force the Royal Navy to adopt convoy tactics and spread its resources out across a broad front, which qualitatively superior German warships could then exploit to slowly but surely gain victory. The largest expansion of German naval power under the Republic took place in 1929, when the construction of the 3 Deutschland-class Panzerschiff heavy cruisers began. The Deutschlands were designed as anti-blockade ships, capable of easily defeating smaller cruisers and older battleships while outrunning newer battleships. They were also blatantly in violation of the Versailles Treaty, being nearly 3,000 tons over the displacement limit of 10,000. Far more secretive was the Reichsmarine's U-boat program, made of a corps of veteran officers from the Great War, who conspired to not only keep their traditions alive, but contribute to whole new designs that would form the basis of Nazi Germany's underwater flotilla. Amongst this cadre was Karl Donitz, a man whose illustrious career would see him rise to the leadership of the Third Reich itself. History, however, would not force the Kaiser's veterans to toil in obscurity for much longer. After dismantling the Weimar Republic and instituting his new German Reich in 1933, Adolf Hitler began pouring money into new military projects, including the Reichsmarine, which he would rename to the Kriegsmarine in 1935. Prior to this, Admiral Raeder had his first personal conversation with the Führer in April of 1933, and the first plans for a small escort-class carrier were drawn up just a few months later. This marked a shift in German naval strategy away from defensive warfare and towards domination over the Atlantic. It also marked the beginning of a tangled snarl of dead-end designs, misappropriated materials, and convoluted expansion plans that would render the Kriegsmarine a pale shadow of what it could have been. Chief amongst these boondoggles would be the carrier program, which by 1934 consisted of three 15,000-ton vessels, whose designs included several turrets and a proposed range of 12,000 nautical miles. This was almost immediately curtailed to two carriers after the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty in 1935, limited the Kriegsmarine to 35% of the Royal Navy's size. This treaty was considered essential at the time, as the now General Admiral Erich Raeder believed that parity with the Royal Navy was impossible for at least a decade. Fortunately, Raeder could rest easy thanks to Hitler's solemn and sincere promise that war with Great Britain was not even a consideration, and work on the first carrier, later known as the Graf Zeppelin, began in December of 1936. While arguments about the German carrier force raged back and forth, the newly promoted Admiral Karl Donitz was busy building up Germany's U-boat flotilla, spurred on by his unrelenting belief that it would be the key to strangling British commerce. The Anglo-German Naval Treaty had permitted the expansion of the submarine fleet, and Donitz quickly determined that the Type 7 design was the most flexible overall, while the far larger Type 9 was best in the West Mediterranean. But the submarine program would have its own issues. With contracts for gigantic multi-turreted cruiser submarines being enthusiastically endorsed by older admirals with absolutely no idea what they were doing. This highlighted another issue that the Kriegsmarine was facing: a lack of large diesel engines. Under Raeder's strategic vision, diesel-powered capital ships could race across the Atlantic and sweep aside any smaller vessels they encountered. Unfortunately, even the vaunted German engineering companies were unable to construct such gigantic generators, forcing Germany to fall back on traditional steam engines. Nevertheless, Germany continued pushing the technological envelope, and in 1936, the keels of the iconic Bismarck and Tirpitz were laid down, with both to be equipped with radar and fire control systems and catapults for reconnaissance floatplanes. By late 1937, Hitler realized that war with Great Britain was likely and called for an expansion of the Kriegsmarine. War games determined that smaller carriers were best suited to the kind of commerce raiding operations against the Royal Navy, but new designs would not be ready for years. On the other hand, Donitz was busy using radio technology to introduce the concept of wolfpack tactics to his submarine fleet. This involved squadrons of U-boats working together to attack enemy targets from multiple angles. while coordinating their movements via radio transmissions to and from a centralized command station on the mainland. Dönitz also exhaustively drilled his men in nighttime surface attack operations, something no other submarine fleet was training for at the time. 1938 would see the incomplete Graf Zeppelin being symbolically launched in a grand ceremony that failed to disguise the fact that she had no planes, no fire control system, and that Hermann Göring would rather have seen her explode in the harbor and hand over a single pilot to the Kriegsmarine. As the storm clouds grew over Europe, the Kriegsmarine embraced the idea of operational flexibility, resulting in both the double pole strategy and the notorious Plan Z. The double pole approach emphasized single high-endurance warships waging war against British commercial interests, while two small battle groups maintained control of the North Sea with a carrier each. Plan Z, meanwhile, was a last-ditch effort for parity with the Royal Navy, approved by Hitler in January 1939. Plan Z mandated the construction of an enormous new force that included 10 battleships, 4 carriers, 15 Panzerschiff, and many other vessels. But Plan Z assumed war with Britain wouldn't occur until 1944 and was cancelled the instant war broke out in September of 1939. Ultimately, the Kriegsmarine would enter the Second World War as a third-rate naval power at best. As Raeder himself wrote in his diary, "We are not in a position to play anything like an important part in the war against Britain's commerce." Dönitz was also horrified by the outbreak of hostilities, having only about 24 Atlantic-proof U-boats operational and no warm water ports to service them in winter. Even so, the Kriegsmarine would quickly swing into action. While it lacked a powerful surface navy, it did enter the war with a number of mine layers that were able to clog up the English coast, Baltic coast, and West Frisian Islands with explosives that would continue to losses well into 1944. Another surprising success were the Hilfskreuzers, a force of 10 auxiliary cruisers, aka militarized merchantmen. Though no match for a real warship, the Hilfskreuzers proved astonishingly cost-effective, requiring a mere 3,000 sailors to crew every ship and able to operate across the world. The Hilfskreuzers would eventually sink 850,000 tons worth of Allied shipping, putting them nearly on par with the whole rest of the surface fleet in terms of total tonnage sunk. The older ships, such as the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff, had a far worse track record, with the Admiral Graf Spee being trapped and scuttled in the River Plata after a brief anti-shipping operation in the South Atlantic. The lack of diesel engines also limited the range of heavy commerce raiders, Hippo and Prinz Eugen Duck. Perhaps the most significant contribution by the Kriegsmarine to the early stages of the war occurred during Operation Weserübung, aka the invasion of Norway and Denmark, where they provided transport and fire support for the Wehrmacht. Like most German operations in 1940, Weserübung was a huge gamble, and the resulting loss of 10 destroyers, 1 heavy, and 2 light cruisers was deemed acceptable to secure Sweden's iron ore in Norwegian heavy water. Another blow was dealt to the Royal Navy when the 2 fast battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau easily sank the carrier HMS Glorious, while German cryptologists were able to crack British naval codes and locate many merchant convoys. By early 1941, the Kriegsmarine had arguably reached its zenith. Thanks to gaining full access to the ports in occupied France and churning out new submarines at a rate of 16 per month, allowing large wolf packs to roam 1,000-mile width of sea beyond the reach of Allied air cover. This was known as the happy time, when British sonar and radar was rarely encountered, and the convoy system was still unrefined, leading to many easy kills. The surface fleet also saw major successes with the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, disrupting the transatlantic trade network. But naval resources kept being diverted towards supporting the land war with the Soviet Union, while the British broke the Enigma code in the spring, leading to a major uptick in U-boat losses before the Morse code wheels were added. Raeder and any other commanders believed their time would be better spent in the Mediterranean, where they could cooperate with the Italian Navy in operations against Malta and Gibraltar. This was the only theater of the war outside of the Pacific, where the Axis held local naval superiority for a time, and Raeder felt this could be transformed into total regional supremacy. But his lofty dreams would never come true, as the loss of the battleship Bismarck during his maiden voyage dealt a huge blow to the surface fleet, and was compounded when its supply ships were also located and sunk. This left Donitz and his submarine corps to pick up the slack, which he did commendably, sending over 8 million tons of Allied ships to the bottom of the ocean between 1941 and 1942. The entry of America into the Second World War also marked a high point in U-boat success rates, as the American Admiralty stubbornly refused to adopt the convoy system, maintain radio silence, or black out their cities. This led to what German U-boat captains would call the Second Happy Time, as submarines roamed back and forth among the American coastline, sinking dozens of undefended merchant ships that were perfectly silhouetted against the bright lights of coastal cities. As the war dragged on, Admiral Raeder found himself being supplanted by Donitz, whose U-boat fleet was now operating at peak strength, while the surface fleet had all but stagnated, with most of the Kriegsmarine's resources now devoted to submarines. Raeder was barely able to convince Hitler to resume work on the Graf Zeppelin in 1942. Winter of that year saw 100 active-duty submarines sinking 627,000 tons of Allied ships. But in May, the tides turned dramatically, as the Enigma machines failed to keep up with advances in Allied cryptology, resulting in most U-boat positions being identified. Within 1 month, 47 U-boats were lost, forcing a horrified Donitz to withdraw from the Atlantic or face annihilation. With the U-boat flotilla now on the back foot, and the surface fleet incapable of sustained offensive operations, Hitler ordered all remaining capital ships scrapped, prompting Admiral Raeder's resignation, and forcing Donitz, as the new chief of the Kriegsmarine, to plead with the Führer to reconsider. Donitz convinced Hitler to preserve the surface fleet, but at the cost of halting all ongoing shipbuilding projects, including the scheduled completion of the Graf Zeppelin. The U-boat flotilla did persist, however, aided by new designs with electrical drives and snorkels, which enabled high-speed underwater operations safe from detection by radar. But this was simply too little, too late. And as Allied tactics grew more and more successful, both Donitz and Hitler began sending the remaining surface vessels scurrying back to port at a hint of danger, which meant they were bombed to pieces at anchor instead. Donitz also refused to acknowledge the dangers posed by wireless direction-finding aircraft and ASDIC-equipped surface escorts, leaving his U-boats underprepared to deal with opponents now fully equipped to counter their operation. For all intents and purposes, the Kriegsmarine ceased to exist as a factor in the war by 1944, when Germany's largest remaining warship, the Tirpitz, was sunk after a career even less noteworthy than its sister ship, the Bismarck. In the final accounting, 6.1% of Allied shipping losses were inflicted by German surface raiders, 6.5% by mines, 13.4% by air attack, and 70% by U-boats. The Kriegsmarine sank around 14.5 million tons of American, British, and Russian shipping, killing an estimated 72,000 sailors. But by early 1944, 99% of Allied ships were reaching their destinations intact. Although this may give the impression that the Kriegsmarine was useless in the Second World War, it's important to remember the impossible odds they faced. Ultimately, men like Raeder and Dönitz did the best they could with far fewer resources than either the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe. Dönitz had hoped to amass a submarine flotilla of at least 300 U-boats by the time Germany went to war, but had to make do with only a few dozen as late as spring of 1940. Raeder likewise estimated he needed at least twice as many ships as he had in 1939 to pursue even a limited war with Britain. And unlike the U-boat fleet, nearly every loss was irreplaceable. In many ways, the Kriegsmarine was the most effective branch of the German military. They just happened to be by far the smallest and tasked with covering a greater area than both the other branches combined. Under such circumstances, there could only ever have been one outcome: